Greetings, my name is Michael Miller. This is a Michael Miller trademark training video out to you because you're watching. Thank you and welcome. It's meant for Michael Miller Pilates licensed affiliates, the Core Core, my patrons, and anyone interested in surviving and thriving as a Pilates instructor. It's Monday, so it's an accumulation of Saturday and Sunday notes and Monday as well. But I pared it down to 5 things, 5 titles, and the first title is A More Uniform Distribution of Tension. That's the title. A more uniform distribution of tension. So, a long time ago, before my trademark became such, I was looking at, or for, springs that I could use in demonstrations and classes that had an opposite coil to them. And see, I've got to like wind them up tighter so that they'll take up less space, which in turn would make longer here. Oppositional rotation between axes. This spring physically comes from a one-time owner of the Swiss Chalet on the Boulder Mall, who gave me other favorites as well. Little dainty springs that are one piece. This is 2 springs that are taped together in the middle, but there are other springs, smaller, that are made in clocks that are called S-shaped springs. And they're made that way, so I'm told by the watchmaker, they're made that way for a more uniform distribution of tension. And of course, anybody with my bias and would love that kind of description. That that springs shaped opposite like this in spring making, when they used to use springs for this kind of thing, were used in that shape for a more uniform release of the tension in the spring. Okay, so I think that's cool. Number 2 is empty Pilates. How can Pilates be empty at all? And yet, in my broadcast to you about the point of view of MMP and the focus on Joe's definition of contrology is complete coordination of body, mind, and spirit, okay, then for me, Pilates is empty without spirit. And there's a lot of an expression of Pilates without any spirit in it at all, which is also cool that Pilates can be so embraced and still found to be so treasured. Okay. And of course, I'm saying more than just the abstraction of whatever you mean by body, mind, and spirit if there's no spirit, right? It's empty for me. I mean, it's like, come on, we got to involve spirit in this, and from the MMP point of view, spirit is what? And that means observing to me, right? But when it comes down to pointing to the human being and talking about biology, you may address the being as the body, and the mind in the MMP point of view is prefrontal cortex, thinking, and then spirit as observing is what the amygdala and the hippocampus and the older, more reptilian parts of the necessary as ever parts of the brain that give input, sensation into what the world's like out there. I mean, maybe what it's like out there, each human being. So, number 3, Pilates is like a child. Like it or not, it's going to grow up. And then my notes on that were it's going to grow up and think for itself. It's going to grow up and have a mind of its own. You know, these are hackneyed old expressions. It's going to grow up and have a sense of itself. A little more refined and takes it out of just the thinking part of what happens when a human being grows up. But it has its own sense of itself, right? And in that regard, becomes more of what it already is. So the title was what? The title is Pilates is like a child. And like it or not, it's going to grow up. And it's going to think for itself and have a mind of its own and become more of what it already is. Right? An expansion of that, right? And in that regard, eccentric, out from center. Why am I talking about that? To survive as a Pilates instructor, I think it's important to see how Pilates is perceived in the culture of its own and then the broader public, right? What matters to me is that you have an ability to access a point of view that has a clarity at different levels and across different generations, because it's ideal. You know, so my take is that if Pilates, as it's perceived and what we make of it within the Pilates culture of humanity, right? Like it or not, that conceptualization is evolving and growing as humanity's involvement with it is what grows it. Right? To survive as a Pilates instructor, I would take me as an example, and I would take me as an example. I would take me as an example. When surviving as a Pilates instructor. Oh, as an example of someone that has taken a point of view, looking for an ideal, a theory that looks for an ideal within Joe's original work, his book, the 3 things in his book that the theory of the ideal is based on. Okay. Now, that's, I think, transcendent because it takes the Pilates culture someplace new, because it takes to looking at Pilates through the legitimacy and authority of an ideal interpretation of Joe's words as its source of authority and legitimacy and credibility. How well you understand what it is for what it is can matter a lot in making you effective as a Pilates instructor, regardless of what else is draped around it, or mixed in it, or evolved from it. Right? So as Pilates culture grows and people's passion pursue it and express it, for all of the ornamentation that ends up on the tree itself is what bears the weight of the ornamentation. And as a Pilates instructor, I want to know about the tree and what makes the tree what it is so that I can water it and have it grow stronger and taller and longer. Number 4. I like the way this came out. Number 4 is, my students are my teachers. My students are my teachers. And that can be looked at in so many ways. When I had a previous participant in a mat workshop, in a mat class that was before a workshop, and they asked me, well, why didn't you cue this? Because it made such a big difference for when you did it for me last time. Now, that taught me that I can't say it the same way every time, and that what you overlook may be important to someone to the point that they ask you about it, and you learn that, geez, you don't do it every time the same, and that there are some things in each way you do it that hopefully have value. Which is why I've heard that students that take a trip with me around the carousel find familiar things, but they also see new things or see familiar things in new ways. So don't be afraid to repeat yourself. How else are they my teachers? For the longest time, I was just pointing to a drawing that showed the hips, the shoulders, and the ears. And a student said to me, "Come on, Mike, let's go lower. What about the legs?" And then that ended up, of course, ending up like this, and recognizing again all the more that the human being controls oppositional rotation between axes, around which it's capable of rotating. So we're working on my teachers, and so that was a whole student-driven thing where my passion was on what I was trying to project, and reflection from a student said, yeah, and what about this? That becomes, see, you know this. The more you teach, the more you recognize your teaching is this collaboration in learning, right? And that the role of teacher and student is intermingled and almost indistinguishable. Yeah. In her memory, I tell this story of a student that was very gifted in their being and was attending a training and was very outward toward other people and just full of capability. Okay? And was getting the standard norm of, well, it takes time, and you have to take classes, and then you have to do this, and a whole set expectation of monetization toward empowerment. Maybe that should be a title. The Monetization Toward Empowerment. Somebody once said, enlightenment can take 3 years, 30 years, or 3 seconds. And I think part of that just means that to achieve a new point of view, right? So number 4 was my students are my teachers. And so I thank all of you that have taught me, even if all you've done is hang out in the cosmos and observe. Because of the nature of the cosmos. So number 5. This is a quote I just heard Kara Swisher on CNBC quote somebody else that says, the main thing is to focus on the main thing. So when it comes to Pilates and this broadcast and me applying that quote that they were talking about something else on, when it comes to Pilates, the main thing is to focus on the main thing. Now you're listening and you're smug and you knew all this before, or you've already heard it before. What's the main thing? Depends on what broadcast you're listening to, probably, but hopefully consistently in some regard. Within the point of view of MMP, the main thing is the experience. The experience. Can you feel that? You can feel it. So the main thing for MMP is an experience, and that means that you can feel it. Which is different than whether you get it or not. And I think a lot of people feel Pilates without getting it in a way that doesn't get in the way of what they're doing and what they're enjoying. You know? Pilates works at a lot of different levels. In a lot of different ways, but the main thing is the main thing, and within MMP, the main thing is the experience. Okay, so you've been listening. What is the experience? If you say complete coordination of body, mind, and spirit, give yourself a gold star, but just in your mind's eye and not literally, because people start asking you what you're doing. And it sounds very self-congratulatory when you're acknowledging in yourself as a teacher that your student just said, I can feel that. And in that regard, as an instructor, at least an MMP instructor that's looking to make sense, that's a good indication. Now you might ask, what do you feel? And what they describe is completely opposite of what you were hoping for. But at least you're dealing on a sensational level and not keeping it restricted to an intellectual one. All right, so main thing. So the main thing, in my opinion, that I promulgate through MMP as a point of view of Pilates is that the main thing is the experience. There comes your next client after many in a row. But they're there for me, from my point of view, for the very same thing that the previous numberless came for. They want to do Pilates, And the more they know Pilates, usually, the more traditional they want to perform the movement, because there's purity in the tradition that you're after. And so you're not doing the tradition as historical reenactment. You're doing the tradition because of its purity as a conditioning response we make in hopes to survive. So Joe defined his work in that definition. MMP seeks to explain Pilates based on a theory that there is an ideal within the original work of Joe, his words, 3 things out of his book. And if you've been watching, you know what those 3 things are, right? They're part of being a presenter. Joe's definition, Joe's promise, and Joe's sequence. We've just spent time talking about Joe's definition. If I were to presume that Joe defines his work by his own words, then MMP defines the ideal that MMP sees within Joe's original work. The evidence being 3 things from his book: his definition, his promise, and his sequence. And his promise is more of a statement that ends up as a promise, and that's that very next paragraph. Contrology develops the body uniformly. Do you take him at his word for that, or do you just think he's making some vague generalizations about his work so that you can go on doing the same thing? And so you know that if Pilates is truly a whole body exercise or effort or doing this, it takes core new tension to get there. And that's oppositional rotation between axes. So Joe's definition, Joe's promise, and Joe's sequence, the only other 2 things to know to be a presenter of CT and MMP. One of them I just gave you was oppositional rotation between axes. That's what's going on here in my trademark. So my trademark points to the physics in the human being that it uses to accomplish moving through space, to accomplish the desire of uniform engagement. Why is uniform engagement the target? Because that's what makes you lightest in space. Because that's what most efficiently bears the load of your body in space. The symphonic contribution of muscularity to your movement. But you survive. This is running from the dinosaur. And the dinosaur is what? Gravity. So my closing notes were: use toys to demonstrate. Like I used this spring. It's so nice to have my toy bag out of the car and next to me here. You can see it and believe it. Moreover, you can feel it and believe it, or wait until someone else comes along and tells you it's okay. I was once contacted by someone that was putting together a study to prove that Pilates works. And I said, thank you, but I'm not interested. He said, well, why? I said, because I already know that Pilates works. And I'm actively employing what I know as my profession. See? Now that's, of course, whatever you do as an instructor is up to you. Have your own insurance, have your clients sign a waiver, have wherever you're working, have their insurance, and then when in doubt, leave it out. From Steve Giordano. When in doubt, leave it out. Now I'm sure he got it from somewhere as well, but that's who I got it from. As a maxim, and really if you have any doubt at all about an exercise you're contemplating doing with a student, leave it out. You know, there's way too much to know and to offer and to explore and develop in without needing to go to someplace you openly have doubts about. So when in doubt, leave it out. And then the footnote to that, I wish there was something cute in a rhyme, but if I've left something out in a session and yet I come back to feeling like I want to go do that, if I can't let go of it, then I head towards doing it, and usually I get to where I wanted to go to before I get to the place I was headed, once I started heading there. Being a Pilates instructor is a high art, and the first thing to do is to have fun, and that of course means that you don't hurt your client or yourself in the engagement. So my notes, my closing notes about using toys and things, I say you have to put it together between your ears. You have to know for yourself. See, and part of the knowing for yourself comes from the experiencing for yourself as well. And for whatever the Pilates culture, you, me, or anyone wants to personalize or improvise something other than what is there in the ideal, that's part of your joyous expression as a human being. And the ideal that exists within supports you to the extent that it can because of what it is. So if what you're doing is very muscle specific at a time without engaging the whole body, if it's concentric instead of eccentric, if you're in some way moving or coming toward a center, if it's compressive, that doesn't feel much like Pilates. If you do weird choices in weights, or if you do something that's not progressive in the loading that you're doing, in the exercises that you're doing, then loading is certainly not matching up to what exists in Joe's choreography. If there's no flow, if it's stop and start, if there's no flow at all and it's all intellectualization, if it's all thinking, so there's no flow much at all, if any, and that flow has no place in whatever's going on because it's the thinking that's mattering. Okay. Well, to me that belongs in a workshop. and not the delivery of instruction for a mat class or for a student in the pursuit of doing that mat class. And now to Facebook. It's so strange. I think I'm actually getting recordings on YouTube. So whenever you show up, I'm glad you did, and I hope this makes sense. Because life can't live forever. Read between the lines and see behind the curtain and add two and two. After you've evaluated points of view, be Columbus and Aretha Franklin. Learn how to embrace someone's karma. If it's still out there, go to patreon.com and become a patron to try to preserve my website. Because I took it down and I realized just how much of the information that I refer to and point to is out there no more. And regardless if anybody else cares about its availability, maybe I should just make it passworded to myself. And that doesn't feel right either, right? So go to patreon.com and set up an account for yourself as a creator to allow others to support you at the level in which they're interested in doing so and capable of. So as an example, go to michaelmillerpilates and see all the different tiers at which you can support me, that maybe someone will like you much better and much better than me, but be able to support you in that way. Because to survive as a Pilates instructor will take an ability to swim in the electrons, and the more avenues you have of direct income towards you without having to go through an intermediary, the easier it will be for you to be Christopher Columbus and Aretha Franklin. We're on evaluating 2 and 2, right? This presentation of Joe's 3 things and the 2 things from MMP maybe it won't be in my lifetime or your lifetime or lifetimes to come, but unless this completely gets buried over by those around the world that are familiar with it, in the year 4040, Cornu will have been obvious for a couple thousand years. Well, no, 1,000 years. So in 1,000 years, and 1,000 years after in 4040, the ideal in Pilates will just be what it is, and Joe will be known for what is obvious in what he left us, if you care to look at it for what it is. My opinion. Direct your thinking. Because if you aren't, somebody else is. Geist.